recently, the Pangu, which was seized and auctioned off from Guowengui, the tallest building, they've actually they've decapitated the little flame that was at the top. It's now been rendered kind of like an ordinary high-rise in Beijing, which in some ways feels like a punctuation mark on this whole tale.
Yeah, a nice little bit of closure there. So, as you can probably already hear, we're kind of doing an experiment today where we're going to be scripted. So, Evan, I actually only have one real question for you, which is essentially, what, after all this time that you've spent reporting on this guy, all this time that you've spent talking to people who you don't know, what do you think is the deal with this guy? I mean, is there kind of like an Occam's razor answer that cuts through all and okay? I mean, I got my theory.
Sure.
Jeremy,
yeah. If I can give you my theory, sort of bottom line up front, and then we can go into the details.
It's not very believable.
I think in the end, this is the story of a survival, and maybe even of a survivor, I should say, maybe even a survivalist in a very recognizable way. I think that all of us who have spent a lot of time in China, particularly traveling around hinterlands, would recognize. I mean, he's a guy who's one of 8 children from a little village, Xicaoying village in Shandong province, and not the prosperous part of Shandong. Eventually, makes his way up through the rough and tumble years of like the Henan kind of real estate. This is all during, all of those kind of harrowing tales of Henan with blood selling and all this other stuff. It was just a rough place. It was a kind of primeval capitalist experiment.
Gangster's paradise.
Yeah, well, in defense of my ancestral province, it has the population the size of the unified Germany, and it's the physical size of the state of Missouri.
Your fellow province mates are thugs, basically, is what you're saying. But yes.
My co-provincials are not thugs. They are gentlemen and scholars, and they are the denizens of the venerable Zhongyuan.
But I do think it captures, like, Henan is a really specific culture of that time, and like, so he kind of gets his way out of there, makes his way to Beijing, figures out the system in Beijing, whatever that system is, whether it's like, you got to have this kind of power on your side, you got to have this kind of muscle on your side. And eventually, because one of these deals goes haywire, off he goes to the United States. And what I think is kind of fascinating is he figured out our system of power and money. And
plugged straight into Steve Bannon, basically.
Precisely right. Exactly. And so that's so in some ways, whatever you think of him, you have to kind of sit back and kind of marvel at his
the chutzpah.
Right.
I know it's not fashionable anymore to use this word, but the balls of this man, the chutzpah, the ability to come here and just go there with your yacht and be like, I'm the guy.
I've actually been really struck that he more or less took the toolbox that he developed in China about courting powerful people and figuring out how to flatter them, keep them happy, and then just imported that to the United States and discovered that we were quite amenable.
But you know what's so amazing about him is that, like, I mean, this is a man of supremely bad taste. The Pangu Plaza is like one of the most kitschy buildings ever built in the universe. And yet he had Tony Blair, in your article, you report that Tony Blair said that he is a man of impeccable taste.
Quote unquote. You're right.
Quote unquote. I mean, there's something, he has some magic there.
I don't know. I mean, it's weird. It's like we can all smell that kind of sketch on him from like miles away, right? Miles far away.
You know what? I think to my mind, one of the most interesting things that came out in this reporting was his experience with Orville Schell. And Orville.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about that.
Should I give just a short description of that? I found that kind of fascinating because Orville, as many listeners will know, is a really seasoned China hand. He's the head of the U.S.-China Center at the Asia Society. He's a journalist and author who's been in and out of China for decades. Really, kind of knows the sort of the soft tissue of the place, can kind of read the moods. And he met Guo Wengui at one point in 2008, and Orville agreed to tell me the story for this piece, which was I was very grateful that he did.
Yeah, it's like, I've known you all these years, Orville. Why have you never mentioned this?
It's
the underground Ferraris.
It's an amazing. So what happened was, in about 2008, right around the time of the Olympics, Orville, whose job is to know as many people involved in the U.S.-China relationship as he can, he was introduced to Guo, who was then calling himself Miles Kwok, and Kwok, aka Guo, invited him to dinner in the private dining room of his dacha up on the top of the Pangu, and he had this chef who prepared like organic cuisine. Guo is very particular about his food. They then went down to the basement to see this underground garage filled with Lamborghinis and Maseratis and fancy cars of every time. And anybody who knows China will know that is actually like a signal that you have a certain kind of backing, because you're able to get that stuff and keep that stuff, which is probably the more difficult act. So then at one point, Orville begins to run into visa trouble. He's written a lot about human rights over the years. And Guo says, well, I can help you with that. I'm going to fix it for you, but you have to talk to some people. And so Orville says, okay, who are these people? And he says, let me introduce you. So he begins a series of meetings, all of them at these tea houses, like fancy tea houses around Beijing, in which it would always be two people, and they would never provide business cards or say
that's always two people.
Well, it's always traveling in two, right?
It's always two people.
I learned that in North Korea. You always travel in two, because that way one can always mind the other. So the two, and they would have these long conversations about U.S.-China relations, and Orville concluded quite rapidly, because it's not his first rodeo, that they were trying to flip him, that they were intelligence officials who were trying to gain his cooperation, and they were offering him things. Of course, he said, look, I didn't know anything. I don't have any classified information, and besides, my job is to try to understand what's going on in the Chinese kind of bureaucratic mind. And so he had these fascinating, he's like, I learned more from those encounters than I ever had in 30 years of visits to China. And he said, but I also learned from that experience that Guo Wengui was extremely well situated with a man named Ma Jian, who was the chief of counterintelligence at the Ministry of State Security. Guo was on the phone with him constantly, according to Guo.
Yeah. Damn it, Orville, why did you never share this story with me? Jeremy, was it two guys for you?
Yeah.
Was it like a really
Was it a pu'er tea? What kind of tea was it?
Yeah, exactly.
Pu'er.
I made them buy me very expensive single malt scotches, actually. The Ministry of State Security is slightly in debt to an Irish bar on Jimbaojia.
They probably own the bar on Jimbaojia, so it's just take from one hand to another.
So basically, my take on this guy, I mean, this is all consistent, but I mean, I think like he's just, he's a straight up grifter, an utterly amoral, pathological narcissist with delusions of grandeur. Does that sound like anyone else you know? Basically, I hate to admit that Steve Bannon, with his, what did you call it, distinctive assemblage of collared shirts, I love that phrase. That will be his Homeric epithet from now on. Steve Bannon with his distinctive assemblage of collared shirts.
By the way, that is the kind of little bit of a sentence that inside the New Yorker we had like multiple emails about, like how to get that.
Did you have to fact check that?
Well, actually, we did have a fact checker spent some kind of heroic time examining a video to try to understand in one particular video how many shirts Steve was wearing.
So actually, I'm sorry to interrupt your flow, Kaiser, but I think it's a good time to
let me finish my thought, though. Let me finish my thought, though.
Okay.
Is that, Steve Bannon was right when he described him as the Donald Trump of Beijing.
Yeah, he really, and it's not the only one.
Yeah.
I mean, I was fascinated the number of people who, from various different points. I mean, Steve Bannon is saying this from a position of great affection for both of them. he described, in fact, even and Bannon even concluded that years ago. It's kind of fascinating. Bannon had spent time in China partly when he was running an online gaming company and was in Shanghai and Hong Kong. And he, at that point, heard about the Pangu, and by his telling, he says, that's when I realized that he was the Donald Trump of Beijing. It was even before later, it was even before Guo joined Mar-a-Lago and actually presented this full array of instincts that are quite Trumpian.
It was Pangu Dasha that convinced him, was it?
Well, I mean, Pangu Dasha is pretty much, it's
the Trump Tower of Beijing.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. And so, but actually, a lot of the people though who are in kind of in these various battles, and there are many with Guo, they too say he's really Trumpian, and I think that's something. What's fascinating about that, from my perspective, is to see that this is an international character. That is a thing, and I'm sure there's somewhere walking around in Dagestan right now that the Donald Trump of Dagestan and the Donald Trump of the Amazon. I just don't know them, but it might be a fun conference.
Well, that one got elected. It was Bolsonaro.
Yeah.
Right. Good point.
I mean, my first kind of media job in Beijing was with a guy running a magazine who was very Trumpian. It's a way to get things done, the chutzpah. You just tell people whatever you want to happen, and it can happen if you're convincing enough. Steve Jobs called it a reality distortion field, or Walter Isaacson did. I'm not sure who coined the phrase.
There is a way of, essentially kind of willing an alternate reality into being. And, that can be obviously very destructive. It can also be, for the person at the center of it, you can run that string out for quite a long time.
You can if you've got the energy. So speaking of energy,
it doesn't work for me. I mean, I've actually tried to implement this playbook. I bought like 1,000 copies of Michelle Obama's memoir. It didn't do anything for me.
Is that what's tacked up on the wall? Is acoustic tile in the?
Yeah, that's what it is. I actually I pulped them.
So, Evan, the New York is famous for its fact checking. So how the fuck is New York fact checking?
Jeremy, man, you're gonna make me beep so
well.
So let me do that again then. Evan, the New Yorker is famous for fact checking. How did they fact check this? And in fact, how did you do your own reporting? Because this, I mean, you have some incredible stories there. You must have given Holden Shell a couple of whiskeys or something, but I mean, that maybe was the easiest. How did you source this information?
This is a challenging piece. This is to put it mildly. But so first on the fact checking, I think, and I have to say, I love the fact checking process of the New Yorker. It really is like a kind of amazing ancient Jesuitical creed that, like, just this way. At first it begins with this idea that things can be ascertained, that you really can, by asking enough people, by being clear, by coming back, you can actually clarify something. And so there were
pretty naive view of the world, I suppose, in some ways.
Well, I mean, this is the reason why this story is hard. Is in this piece I talk about this concept called the wilderness of mirrors, which was an idea that was
James G.
exactly who was the head of CIA counterintelligence from 1954 to 1974, and
America's Own Mind.
And he took that idea from an old T.S. Eliot poem, and like there's this whole idea of ambiguity as being essential to the business of counterintelligence. It's all about, how do you ever judge somebody's motives? How do you ever know if they're bona fide or nullified? Who do they really? Are they a defector that they say they are, or are they still working for somebody? And you put that then in the context of fact checking, which is this very black and white. We can clarify, and it is a bit of a, they are awkward. It's an awkward encounter. But in this case, we had 3 fact checkers who worked on this piece, who will remain nameless, because I don't want to get anybody else involved in this that is not publicly described. And I think, but I'm a great admirer, and we're very grateful for the work that they do, because it's just incredible. And it's so. How do you fact check? Well, one thing you do is you go based on available public records, and there's often more than one thing. oftentimes there's a huge mountain of legal filings in this story on all sides. What, as I mentioned in the piece, is involved in a lot of litigation. He is sort of offered. He's been deposed a number of times. He's offered his own story. People around him have given depositions under oath. There are a number of other people, and then there are other rings of ways. I mean, there's just a lot of people who have encountered him from various governments inside China, outside China, over the years. He's been around a long time, and in these different modes has kind of had so many different meetings that I cast a very wide net, and it didn't take too long to begin to find people who had experiences with him or against him.
Yeah, and I know that you talked to Hushuli before for his story. Did you reach out to the folks in Caixin?
No, I did. Yeah, but I mentioned in the piece their work because it's been really some of the major journalism that I've done appeared in Caixin. And it's worth my saying, Guo denies any wrongdoing, and I think this is important to apply across our conversation. Guo denies wrongdoing, he denies bribing people, he denies many of the things that Caixin reported, and there we are.
Yeah.
I wonder if Hushuli denies having a love child by Wang Xishan.
Yeah, for people who don't know, there's a very kind of bitter backstory between Caixin
and Caixin, let's tease that out a bit. So Caixin is probably the best more or less independent media company in China. It's a business magazine run by a feisty lady. So this feud between them is they have reported some unsavory things about Guo Wei. Guo has alleged some on his own media platforms. Narek has alleged some unsavory things about Hushuli. Is that about right?
Yeah, I think, and then there's litigation involved. But your description is right. As long as we're talking about kind of sources and methods, I want to give a shout out to Mother Jones magazine, which has done some remarkable work on the subject of Guo Wei. And in particular, they got access to some internal recordings that were done. And I recommend anybody who's interested in what I wrote should go and seek out pieces written by Dan Friedman, because there's quite a tale there too.
Yeah, Dan Friedman's done amazing work on that stuff. One of the things that I don't from Jones was you found this letter that claims to be written by Guo, in which he is sort of begging the powers that be in Beijing for a clear mission, saying that he will, go to bat for them. He's gonna, promise not to cross any of Xi Jinping's red lines. That he's loyal to Xi. This is evidence that he may actually be psychic. This is evidence that he might be working for a person a faction inside of Beijing.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you make of that claim?
Well, what's interesting is, so Guo would deny that he's working for a clique inside Beijing, but he doesn't deny writing the letter. In fact, he acknowledges writing the letter, and he's kind of talked about it in a sense. So he wrote this letter in which he said, assign me tasks, allow me to atone for my past mistakes. He said, I want to do good propaganda in my own style of propaganda. He said, I will never cross the red lines, which means essentially the bottom line, however he perceives that. And I think for a lot of folks, particularly dissidents in the United States who distrust his motives, they say this is about as clear as you could get of a roadmap for what was going on, what he was doing. He would say, no, this was an effort on my part to try to negotiate for family members and employees who were arrested, and to try to get assets unfrozen, and to try to break the impasse. And what we don't know is what the result of that letter was. And I haven't seen, if it exists, I don't know about it. I haven't seen if he's talked about getting any kind of response to that. But yeah, there are. So one of the interesting, this goes to Jeremy's question about how you report a story like this. one of the things that's happened over the course of this long process is that he has released a number of recordings of various people and conversations over the years, including, for instance, his own conversation with the Ministry of State Security and Public Security about when they sort of sent a team to New York, kind of a dramatic moment in the piece. They sent a team to try to bring him back, and he recorded it, edited it, released excerpts of it. Then there are other recordings that have been released by sources unknown, and the assumption is that some of that's been released by the Chinese government, by members, by party organs and so on. But it's just it really is like operating in this almost kind of like postmodern world of intelligence and the internet, and everything is available to be recorded and released and can be used as a tool of combat in this long saga. So it's quite unlike any other story I've ever read.
I mean, and you didn't really write about the whole VOA.
Right, yeah. We sort of had to pick our shots. At a certain point, there was like a limit to how much we could include. But basically, and the VOA thing, I think, which was fairly well covered at the time, was...
Just sorry to interrupt, Evan, but I think you're prepping yourself to write a biography of Donald Trump after his death. This is prep work, right?
I don't know. It seems to be a crowded shelf. That's a crowded shelf. I think so. At the time, one of the very first moments that became known to the public on a wide scale was that he agreed to an interview with VOA, and there's a lot of internal dispute about what exactly VOA agreed to do and planned to do. Some of the reporters involved said we had gotten permission to do this extraordinary 3-hour interview with him.
That was Sasha Gong, right? Was the reporter?
Right.
Yeah, Sasha Gong.
Right. And then she ended up working with Guo on some projects afterwards, but then having a big falling out, and has now kind of been one of the people who is accusing him of wrongdoing and so on some projects. But so Guo agreed to Guo was going to do this interview with VOA, and after an hour of the interview, the VOA said, "All right, that's enough. If there's more to do, we'll put it out online." And that
this is evidence that he may actually, you cite this as evidence that he might be working for a pro-Xi Jinping clique, a faction inside of Beijing.
Yeah.
What do you think? What do you make of that claim?
Well, what's interesting is, so Guo would deny that he's working for a clique inside Beijing, but he doesn't deny writing the letter. In fact, he acknowledges writing the letter, and he's kind of talked about it in a sense. So he wrote this letter in which he said, "Assign me tasks, allow me to atone for my past mistakes." He said, I want to do good propaganda in my own style of propaganda. He said, "I will never cross the red lines," which means essentially the bottom line, however he perceives that. And I think for a lot of folks, particularly dissidents in the United States who distrust his motives, they say this is about as clear as you could get of a roadmap for what was going on, what he was doing. He would say, no, this was an effort on my part to try to negotiate for family members and employees who were arrested, and to try to get assets unfrozen, and to try to sort of break the impasse. And what we don't know is what the result of that letter was. And I haven't seen, if it exists, I don't know about it. I haven't seen if he's talked about getting any kind of response to that. But yeah, there are. So one of the interesting, this goes to Jeremy's question about how you report a story like this. One of the things that's happened over the course of this long process is that he has released a number of recordings of various people and conversations over the years, including, for instance, his own conversation with the Ministry of State Security and Public Security about when they sort of sent a team to New York, kind of a dramatic moment in the piece. They sent a team to try to bring him back, and he recorded it, edited it, to try to sort of break the impasse. And what we don't know is what the result of that letter was. And I haven't seen, if it exists, I don't know about it. I haven't seen if he's talked about getting any kind of response to that. But